There are loves that are forbidden, the kind that family and friends shun, or that defy reason itself.
She fell for him, and all of his charms, the way that he made her feel seen, but once she fell, there was no turning back.
She knew it wasn't right, but, it was still just that fun coupled with him being just handsome that, led her to want to explore the possibilities.
And sometimes the one your heart longs for is also forbidden by law itself.
She was playing a very dicey game here, very risky game. It was, almost like her own real life Bonnie and Clyde.
Those types of individuals sometimes are very charismatic. They know how to talk to people. They know how to figure you out. They know how to manipulate you.
Anytime you cross some of those red flags and the lines get blurred, it gets extremely dangerous.
Chasing that temptation to feed your passion could tear apart the life you've built and take your freedom with it.
A killer's on the loose, and with every minute that passed, the public is more and more at risk.
She had this soft spot for him. It's kind of like how you dip your toe in the water and you keep going until, ultimately you may drown.
June 27th, 2015, Polkton, North Carolina. This small town of just over 2,000 people sits an hour east of Charlotte and 90 miles south of Winston-Salem. Besides the churches, dollar stores, and DMV, one major industry dominates the landscape.
There's about 2 gas stations there. It's a very small rural town. It's not a lot of people.
That's usually a prime location for a correctional facility because it gets the inmates out of that normal hustle and bustle type area.
The Brown Creek Minimum Security Correctional Facility is located in Polkton, and it's their main economic driving force.
Just after midnight, the emergency situation that everyone in a prison community fears shatters the night calm. At 12:34 a.m., the Polkton Police Department gets a call from Brown Creek Correctional that an inmate has escaped from custody. Polkton PD is given a physical description of the escapee and immediately issues a bolo for the inmate to the surrounding area. They're looking for a black male, 6'1", 240 pounds, black hair, brown eyes.
Anytime there's an escape, local law enforcement does have to be notified. Whenever they give us that call that there is an escape, immediately we have to report to the facility and we get in contact with the officer in charge, who at that point becomes the incident commander.
When police arrive at Brown Creek Correctional, they question the officers about the missing prisoner.
How long has he been gone? How far has he gotten? What is going on at this point?
The correctional officers tell police that earlier that evening they were passed a note from an offender informant named Earl, saying to check for inmate Christopher McNeil, a potential escapee. And because of Brown Creek's layout, finding any one prisoner immediately isn't a simple task.
Brown Creek was a medium and minimum facility. The way that those facilities are set up is they have like an open dorm. So you'll have like 28 guys that'll be inside one dorm and they all sleep on bunks. There's a lot more room for them to move around. They don't get restricted to like a single cell.
After being alerted to the possibility of an inmate missing, the officers proceed to do a count.
At least 2 staff members would typically be present and they would call for count time. All residents would then need to stand up beside their beds or their bunk areas, and they would line up and the officers would both go through and count. They would compare their counts make sure they both had the same, and they would clear the count.
So in the event that the count does not clear, then we would conduct a recount. Now, the officers have to go to each offender, and the offender has to have their ID card and give the officer their ID card, and the officer looks at the ID card, looks at the offender, and verifies that this is the offender that we have. Then that's when the escape procedures start, if we can't find them anywhere in that facility.
And sure enough, the count comes up short, and prison officials tell police they identified that inmate Christopher McNeil is indeed missing.
29-year-old Christopher McNeil is originally from the Winston-Salem part of North Carolina. He started getting in trouble with the law early on. I mean, his record stretches all the way back to juvenile offenses.
By the time he hit his 20s, McNeil had racked up a string of convictions: assaulting a public official, breaking and entering, resisting arrest, carrying a concealed weapon. His run-ins with the law had turned into a full-blown criminal lifestyle.
In 2007, he was charged with first-degree murder, but he managed to avoid a life sentence by taking a plea deal for a lesser charge, second-degree murder.
Mr. McNeil was serving a 14-year sentence for second-degree murder. He also was a career criminal. So this is someone that they were very, very scared about him being loose in the community.
Now, Polkton PD is working to piece together how McNeil managed to escape. Investigators begin questioning the prison staff to determine if there are any cracks in their security systems.
You have to ask yourself, how safe and how closed off is this correctional facility? Are inmates just wandering on and off the campus whenever they feel like it? You know, how secure is it?
Police are given a basic tour so that they can get a sense of where and how this escape may have happened.
A minimum facility like that are also known as prison camps. There's common areas, there's basketball courts, there's gymnasium activities.
Offenders are able to kind of leave their housing unit, go to another housing unit, maybe if they had some friends or hang out with them.
Despite the inmates' freedom, investigators observe that Brown Creek is surrounded by 10-foot fences topped with concertina wire. But they learned those fences aren't as secure as they seem.
Offenders do use things like sheets, pillowcases, blankets. They'll use extra clothing. They'll use anything that they can get their hands on to put on the barbed wire, and that will help them, get over the fence.
McNeil scaled the perimeter fence, used his pillows over the concertina wire to get over that. The pillows was still on the concertina wire during the investigation.
With the how behind McNeil's escape becoming clearer, Polkton detectives are now left wondering why and what prompted his sudden breakout.
Christopher McNeil had only 3 years left in prison. He had already served 11 years out of a 14-year sentence. Why did he escape now? Why risk it?
Sometimes the pressure of prison life gets too heavy. Even with just a few years left, fear, desperation, or a sudden crisis could push someone to run. Polkton detectives wonder, was McNeil scared or something? Was he running from a threat inside? Or was he chasing something on the outside?
The detectives' questions are piling up. Now they turn their attention to Earl, the man who sounded the alarm about McNeil. And what he tells them will take the case in a whole new direction.
The inmate informant Earl drops a bombshell that changes everything. McNeil didn't escape alone.
In June 2015, Polkton police are in the early hours of investigating the escape of inmate Christopher McNeil from Brown Creek Correctional.
McNeil was serving time for second-degree murder, and with only 3 years left on his sentence, had escaped from the minimum security prison.
The COs received a tip from an informant, Earl, confirming McNeil as the escapee. As authorities dug deeper into how he managed to break out, they discovered pillows and sheets hanging on concertina wire around the prison. Investigators have been working to figure out what led to his escape.
To get more answers, Polkton police question the correctional officer who received the note from Earl. He adds a shocking revelation. Earl's note claims McNeil was escaping to meet a female corrections officer, Kendra Miller, on the outside, and that she was helping him. It's a startling accusation.
Now, if the information is true, this changes everything. An officer on the inside helping McNeil escape, that's not just a breach of security. That's a serious violation of the law and everything the job stands for. Now, investigators have to find Kendra Miller to see how involved she really is.
Kendra Miller was 33 years old. By all accounts, she didn't have a bad background. She seemed to be an upstanding citizen.
The center of Kendra's life are her children. She's a single mother of 4. She was very devoted to her kids. The type of mother that goes to every basketball game, very hands-on, very loving. She worked hard to support her children.
She attended community college and decided to take a job at Brown Creek working in the food service department of the facility as a kitchen officer.
Kitchen officers are typically responsible for operating the dining hall functions, just to keep that running efficiently to get everybody that lives there fed. She would be responsible for monitoring and supervising all of these residents working. She was very polite, very kind, always greeted with a smiling face. You know, what you would expect, what you would want to see out of any correctional officer.
While she was working to support her kids, Kendra also had the support from a boyfriend that she had been dating for about a year now. And according to all of her friends and family, she's very, very much in love with him. She seemed like someone living a regular, law-abiding life, just trying to build stability for her family.
While working in the kitchen, Kendra crossed paths with Christopher McNeil. Over time, the two developed a bond.
But now, detectives are following up on the possibility Kendra Miller was involved in Christopher McNeil's escape. They update their BOLO to include Kendra's physical description and the make and model of her car, a 2001 red Ford Mustang.
So at this point, the investigators go to Miller's home to see if she's there or if the escaped prisoner is there as well. When the officers arrive at the home, they don't find Kendra, but they do find about 4 to 5 children. The oldest of those children was around 16 years old, and she was the daughter of Kendra. And they talk to her, and she gives them a cell phone number for her mother.
With Kendra Miller's cell phone number, detectives have their first solid lead.
The officers know that they have to move fast, and they were able to get a warrant and get access to the data information from the cell phone towers.
Once that warrant is gained, they can start pinging the phone. They can see where they went, where they're at.
But the pings are only accurate to a general area. All throughout the night, the Polkton detectives alert the closest law enforcement agents to the latest ping and send them to carefully search the area.
Ultimately, they had about 11 different pings to give them an idea of where this cell phone was moving. Unfortunately, they didn't find the car, they didn't find Mr. McNeil, and they did not find Miss Miller.
With no leads coming in on pursuit of escaped inmate Christopher McNeil, detectives turned back to where this all started, the Brown Creek Correctional Facility, and arranged to interview the informant who had initially given the tip about the escapee, Earl.
The inmate explains to Polkton police that on the night of the escape, CO Kendra Miller was about to put another inmate into the hole as a punishment for having a contraband cell phone. The inmate being punished insisted that Earl expose that McNeil and Miller had a relationship.
The inmate who was getting put into the hole says he was set up by CO Kendra Miller. He was angry, and so he wanted to get CO Miller in trouble too.
So the inmate said that Mr. McNeil was actually able to leave the facility and come back, and that Mr. McNeil would leave the facility to go engage in sexual acts with Officer Miller.
Earl says that on the evening of the escape, at around 10 p.m., he did in fact see Christopher McNeil leave the dorm without returning.
There are situations where the offenders will just make up something, but in a situation where they allege that there is a relationship between them and a staff member, of course an investigation will be conducted.
It's now 11 a.m., 12 hours since inmate Christopher McNeil escaped from Brown Creek, and there have only been more and more questions overnight and no answers in sight.
Where is Kendra Miller? Did she really run off with McNeil? Did she really abandon her 4 children? Did she really run off with the murderer?
Is Kendra Miller with McNeil under duress? Did inmate McNeil make CO Kendra Miller help him with threats? Is she safe? Is she still alive?
Then, just after 11 a.m. that morning, a shocking development changes everything. The Polkton officers learn that Kendra Miller has made contact with her Brown Creek superiors.
Kendra Miller called and said she's willing to come in and be questioned voluntarily at noon.
Detectives are surprised by Kendra's unexpected call, but determined to uncover the truth about her role in Christopher McNeil's escape.
As they prepare to question her, they wonder what she will reveal. Why did she get involved with an inmate? Did he threaten or abuse her? Did she really help him escape?
If Kendra Miller really did help McNeil, does she know where this dangerous killer is now?
We're always supposed to maintain a professional relationship with the offenders that we supervise, that are under our care. So in the event that it's found out that you start to have that unprofessional, maybe romantic relationship, it's actually a Class E felony charge. That's why we try to educate them as much as possible about the effects and what can happen and how you can be charged if you do, engage in that type of relationship with someone who you are supposed to be the custodial person over.
Inmates at Brown Creek Correctional Facility claim that CO Kendra Miller helped Christopher McNeil escape from the prison because the two were having a sexual affair. And now, about 12 hours after inmate McNeil has gone missing without a trace, Corrections Officer Kendra Miller is coming in voluntarily to be questioned.
Investigators had attempted to track Kendra using cell phone data, but were unable to pinpoint her location or find her vehicle. So when she finally decided to come in and speak to the police, it was a crucial break in the case.
So in this moment, she's just being, interrogated. She is still under her own volition to leave at any moment.
When detectives asked about her whereabouts during the time of McNeil's escape, Kendra Miller insists she was nowhere near the prison at the time of escape.
Kendra Miller says she drove her car to her boyfriend Antoine Shaw's house between 1:30 and 2 a.m. and then went to sleep. She says while she was there, her daughter called on her cell phone and told her that the police were looking for her and that Kendra should call the police.
Kendra is willing to verify to police that her cell phone number is the same one that her daughter had given them, and that they tracked through the night.
The minutes are ticking by, and there's a convicted felon out on the loose. Police push Kendra harder about if she helped him and where he is now.
Kendra Miller sticks to her story and insists that she has no romantic or sexual relationship with McNeil. She says that the other inmates are just lying about her to try to get her in trouble.
She essentially gets to the point where she says she doesn't want to answer any questions, and she shuts it down.
Detectives aren't buying her story. They think that she's just there answering questions to save face, to tell them what they want.
They didn't have enough information. All they had was the word of a prison informant. They didn't have any direct evidence. They technically didn't even have any circumstantial evidence. So at this point, they decided to let her go and continue their investigation.
During the time Polkton police have been interviewing C.O. Miller, Brown Creek officials have been doing their own internal investigations about the night of the escape.
There was a jailhouse recording of an inmate calling Kendra Miller's phone. And in that phone call, they could hear a female answer the phone and Mr. McNeil then speaking to the inmate. And the inmate was telling him that there were officers that were walking outside and that the block was hot and he needed to get back.
For detectives, this is solid evidence linking Kendra Miller and inmate Christopher McNeil. McNeil was reached at Kendra Miller's cell number after the escape.
The general knowledge was that they were in a relationship. Once we receive a report that a staff member may be fraternizing with an offender, and then an investigation will begin at that point.
Getting involved with an inmate is the most basic line a corrections officer should never cross.
It's not uncommon when you have individuals that are career criminals. Those types of individuals sometimes are very charismatic. They know how to talk to people. They know how to figure you out. They know how to manipulate you. So I am imagining that that's exactly what Mr. McNeil did.
As a woman, you're around these men day in and day out. And so you see them, in different scenarios where they're, working hard, possibly sweating. He was a very attractive inmate. At the end of the day, I think she knew, I know she knew it wasn't right, but, it was still just that fun coupled with him being just handsome that, led her to want to explore the possibilities, and that's what she did.
Some people, they may really thrive off of the intimacy. Maybe that is what drives them. Maybe while they're, out in their daily life, they don't receive any intimacy. There's no one that comes up to them and tells them that they're beautiful and tells them, that they would like to spend time with them or be in a relationship with them. But at the end of the day, the offender, they're really just trying to help themselves.
Miss Miller just seemed like a woman who wanted love. Although she had a boyfriend at the time, maybe things weren't that great at home. I think Mr. McNeil played in on that. He could see that maybe there was something missing at home, and he figured out a way as a man with a tough guy, kind of act to soften her and make her feel as though he could ultimately be her protector, but also that he wasn't this bad guy.
With no clear answers from their interrogation of Kendra Miller, detectives instead work on a theory of how she and McNeil devised a plan to spend more time together outside the prison.
Somebody on the inside had to give Mr. McNeil, the layout, so to say. And it's evident that Miller was the one who did it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known how to just get around the facility so easily.
The detectives' theory leaves them with another pressing question.
Kendra Miller needed to ignore what landed him in Brown Creek Prison in the first place. He was a killer, tried and convicted.
A lot of women will overlook certain things for what seems like love or lust. Sometimes it's easy to convince yourself that risk is worth the reward, especially when the connection feels intense. But for Kendra, was it really worth it?
The day after Christopher McNeil's prison break from Brown Creek Correctional Facility, detectives are investigating rumors that CO Kendra Miller may have had an intimate relationship with the inmate, and that she helped him escape. But the path leading to this wild escape first started with a murder years before.
To really understand what happened with Christopher McNeil, investigators need to look back at what led to his current prison sentence.
On March 15, 2007, police discovered the body of 44-year-old Bobby Moore alongside a creek in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He'd been shot to death.
And when police look up Mr. Muir, they find out that he was actually awaiting trial on cocaine trafficking charges.
So that immediately suggests to police that there's a highly likelihood that Bobby Muir's criminal activities had brought him into contact with violent people or violent situations.
Detectives questioned the victim's family. Bobby Muir's girlfriend, Debbie Lewis, tells investigators the last time she saw Bobby alive was at her apartment the morning he was killed, and that Bobby was there with another man, Christopher McNeil. She said that they left together around 6:30 a.m. in McNeil's car.
Police tracked down Christopher McNeil and searched the car he was driving the day of the murder. Despite being cleaned, they find a blood sample that matches victim Bobby Muir. Though the murder weapon isn't found, the blood evidence leads detectives to charge McNeil with first-degree murder.
The blood shows Muir was transported after being shot, suggesting a very premeditated act. Christopher McNeil is very calculating, very cold, very much in control, and strategic.
Detectives believe that while serving his time, Christopher McNeil presented a more sensitive side to Kendra, and she connected with that. He wanted her to see that warmth, and she was attracted to him. And she wanted to get swept up in that, even though she knew exactly what he had done to wind up in prison.
Bobby Muir left behind a longtime girlfriend, parents, siblings, a niece, a whole family that loved him and mourned him. Kendra Miller had to willfully push all of that sadness out of her mind to be able to have a fun romance with Christopher McNeil.
Detectives now have a clearer picture of how Christopher McNeil landed in prison for 14 years and are trying to piece together how Kendra Miller fell for his charms.
It was, breaking up that monotony of her boring Polkton life, and I think she got caught up. It was something that was fun. It was, this almost like her own real life Bonnie and Clyde, the good girl, the bad guy. And I think she just got in too deep and didn't know how to get herself out of it.
Investigators' concerns about finding the convicted killer grow with each passing minute. The search becomes more urgent, and they fear finding him will only get more difficult. In hopes of breaking the case, they decide to revisit Kendra Miller.
Investigators feel that there's just too much information connecting Kendra to McNeil's escape. So they set out to question her again, but this time, she's nowhere to be found.
Detectives now strongly suspect CO Kendra Miller helped inmate Christopher McNeil escape from prison. But they have no idea where she is after her voluntary interview ended late in the afternoon of June 27th, the same day of the escape.
Detectives have traced calls from the prison to Kendra's phone, gathered accounts from inmates, including an informant, and spoken to other correctional officers. Everything in their investigation keeps pointing back to Kendra Miller.
The police department, the detectives had enough information, enough evidence to say, yes, at this moment, we have enough probable cause to believe that she, in fact, committed these crimes. And so that warranted them the right to arrest her at that moment.
Polkton police go to Kendra Miller's primary residence, but are unable to locate her there.
The officers were able to find out that Miss Miller had a boyfriend, and when they called him, they asked if he knew where her whereabouts were. And he said he didn't know where she was and that she wasn't with him.
Officers show up to his home. His father answers the door, and officers ask, we're looking for Officer Miller. Have you seen her? And I'm assuming the father was, unaware of what was happening in that moment, and he totally says, yeah, she's back in my son's room. And so the father leads them to the son's room, and there Miss Miller is laying across the bed.
Police arrest Kendra Miller, and charge her with felony aiding and abetting a fugitive, harboring a fugitive, and having sex with an inmate.
It appeared that she had taken some medication and drank some alcohol, so they did transport her to the local hospital. Once she is looked at and cleared by the doctors, she arrives at the Town Hall Police Department.
But Kendra Miller refuses to help law enforcement any further to recapture her lover, Christopher McNeil.
There's a huge amount of pressure here for detectives. Kendra Miller might know where Christopher McNeil is right now. She might have given him money and know exactly where he's going next. But she's not talking. And the public is still at risk. Christopher McNeil is a convicted murderer, and he's still out there. Police had to do everything they can to track this escaped killer down.
Police look into Christopher McNeil's background and determine he may have family about 2 hours north of the Brown Creek prison.
The officers believed that he had family members that were in the Winston-Salem area.
Public safety is always the #1 concern. And how can you warn the public or let people know who you're looking for?
Detectives notify local media and law enforcement in Winston-Salem to set up a watch for McNeil.
Mr. McNeil's face is all over the news channels. You know, his rap sheet is being, plastered everywhere. This causes people around that Winston-Salem area to be on the lookout.
The investigating officers were receiving reports that there were sightings of Mr. McNeil in the Winston-Salem area.
Police get a call that there's a confirmed McNeil sighting on Timlick Avenue in Winston-Salem. This is the closest they've been to capturing the inmate since the escape.
We'll meet up with whoever the person is that reported this sighting, and then we'll try to figure out more information. What did this person look like? What did their demeanor look like?
Police bring in scent dogs to try to pick up McNeil's trail from Timlick Avenue. But there's no luck.
He had family members there as well. They were doing somewhat of a stakeout of the family members' residence.
Detectives begin monitoring Kendra's phone calls while she's in custody and intercept a call that reveals that a female relative of McNeil's and another female friend have been helping him in Winston-Salem. The women are both charged with harboring a fugitive.
With these two women in question, they didn't want to incriminate themselves. Although they had already been helping Mr. McNeil get about town at that moment, they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't get in any deeper trouble. And so they said, hey, we think he's here. Maybe check this location, this address.
Frustratingly, the female relative's tip doesn't lead to McNeil. The next steps in the investigation actually come from Good Samaritan sightings of Christopher McNeil heading north along the highway.
Law enforcement was on the trail of this guy. They were receiving reports that he had been seen in Forsyth County, and they also received reports that he was seen getting on the back of a motorcycle and then going on Highway 52.
Late that night, all the patience and groundwork laid by investigators pays off. At about 11 p.m. on Sunday, June 28th, passers-by notice a man fitting Christopher McNeil's description walking north along Highway 52 near the Davidson-Forsyth County line.
Anytime that we apprehend an offender, you never know what's going to happen. Once you see the offender and you're going towards them, you don't know what they're going to do because obviously their back is against the wall. They could attempt to do anything. You don't know whether they're armed.
Your main thought and focus is to get this person back into custody without struggle, without having to, use physical force against the person on the run. These officers are just trying to ultimately get the job done. Get him back in custody, get him back to a facility, and, ultimately make the public feel safer again.
The police approached him and they took him back into custody without incident.
In just under 2 days, Christopher McNeil's wild prison escape has come to an end. But so many questions remain.
Investigators still don't know how was this convicted killer was able to lure a loving mother of 4, a member of the Thin Blue Line herself, onto a path of lawlessness and mayhem. She had everything to lose over just one
standard. As an officer within the Corrections Department of North Carolina, there were rules and boundaries that she had to set. Mr. McNeil, he saw that unfortunately Miss Miller had this soft spot for him. It was just to a point where he kept testing her, staying over for shifts, saying all the right things, as a man may say to a woman who may have been lonely at the time. And so it just turned into something where it sounds like she let her guard down.
Noted mother of 4 and corrections officer Kendra Miller allegedly helped her inmate lover walk away from prison. But now convicted killer Christopher McNeil has finally been apprehended.
Once the investigative officers were able to get in front of Mr. McNeil, he actually implicated Kendra and said that she helped him to get out of the prison.
Though he did have this ongoing, relationship with Officer Miller, that wasn't his that wasn't his focus at that moment. He was thinking about self. He had to, rat her out and let them know that this wasn't all me. Had it not been for her giving me the access throughout the facility, mapping out a plan for me to, basically escape, whenever we met up, I would not be in this position. And so I feel like that was his motive. If I rat her out, maybe it'll lessen the blow for me, and hopefully, my sentence or my consequences won't be as great.
Christopher McNeil gives a statement to detectives that helps them piece together what happened on the night of June 27th.
He had this routine carved out, maybe they mapped it out together, where he went from point A to point B, ultimately to get outside of the prison wall and meet up with Miller.
McNeil explains how he and Kendra Miller would usually meet. He would walk through the dorm, then scale the chain-link fence using his sheets and pillow to protect himself from the concertina wire. Officer Kendra Miller would park her red Mustang outside the fence, and they would have their intimate time in the car.
McNeil told investigators that after their rendezvous, he would then do the process in reverse and return himself to the prison.
When you're doing something and you're saying, oh, I'm getting away with this, you keep pushing that boundary. And so I think that's this case. And so once they started doing it, it became routine. This is something that just became second nature. He was no longer thinking about the consequences. Obviously no longer was Officer Miller, and they just kept going with it.
On the night of the escape, Officer Miller parked outside the prison fence, and Christopher McNeil met her just like usual.
The other part of the system they had in place was that McNeil gave an inmate friend Officer Miller's cell phone number to warn them about any problems that might come up while McNeil was on the outside.
Then around midnight, the night of the escape, the informant, inmate Earl, passed a note to Brown Creek officers saying inmate McNeil was missing, which ultimately derailed the date between Kendra Miller and Christopher McNeil while McNeil was still outside.
In a strange kind of irony, Kendra Miller was partially telling the truth. The inmates who informed on her were trying to get her in trouble as a retaliation for putting one of them in the hole. They were just telling a true story to do it.
Investigators got more details on the phone call made to McNeil after the count that night didn't clear and the alarm was raised.
Once the facility itself had gone onto lockdown, or they implemented this, search, so to say, for the missing inmate, which was Mr. McNeil, the inmate decided to call and warn his friend that ultimately his way to get back in would probably not work. They had this understanding, and so he was upholding his end of the agreement by warning Mr. McNeil.
That's when CO Kendra Miller and inmate Christopher McNeil understood Christopher would be spotted climbing the fence if he tried to go back inside, and they'd both be in trouble. McNeil was trapped on the outside of the prison.
Ultimately, he was not trying to escape. His intention was to visit a woman and come back in undetected. In the time that the confidential informant passed the note, the count happened, they go into the procedures, the police come, all the things happen, they get scared and decide to flee instead of returning.
I think in that moment he just panicked. Because now the prison is on lockdown due to a missing inmate, he can't do that. And so I think in that moment, it was kind of flight or fight.
Though Kendra Miller won't admit to it, police believe she drove Christopher Miller up to Winston-Salem, where he had family contacts.
If I'm going to run, at least get me as close to my family as possible. I know they're gonna have my back. They're probably gonna be willing to let me stay or hide out, and they're probably gonna be more than likely willing to lie on my behalf to keep me safe, to keep me free.
But once Christopher McNeil was up in Winston-Salem, he had no idea what to do next. There was no escape plan, so he was soon apprehended by law enforcement.
It's easy to understand why Christopher McNeil will want freedom from prison. And the question on everyone's mind is why Kendra Miller would get involved with this man or help him get outside the fence.
Why risk losing your job? Why risk being put in jail? Your kids possibly being taken away?
She was so caught up in the situation with him that she decided to, go along with these plans and then assist him in these plans. And it just shows how deep these type of relationships can get.
After the drama of the Brown Creek prison escape, the legal system handed out moderate sentences and restored order to the area.
Mr. McNeil received an additional 23 months added to his sentence. And Ms. Miller pled guilty to obstruction of justice and received 6 months of probation. She also lost her job.
You have to look at what good will it do? What is justice in this situation for this person in this setting? And ultimately, I think that reducing those charges and her taking her plea was probably the best thing for everybody involved. This way, she still got to take care of her children, and then the public and justice in general still got something, a guilty verdict. I think it was a fair outcome. And I hate that that happened, and I hope she's okay now.
To the residents of Polkton, Kendra Miller may have crossed just about every boundary possible as a corrections officer. But she also didn't have the help of strong guardrails to help keep her on a safe path.
Kendra didn't really have anyone to steer her away from this, to tell her to slow down or take a step back, and really see the danger of getting involved with McNeil. So she followed her heart and risked everything for her man.
Ultimately, this situation does not make Miss Miller a bad person. It made her a vulnerable person who fell victim to somebody's manipulation and possibly.
The neon-soaked, humid night of August 2012 in Miami did not just witness the rhythmic thumping of bass lines spilling from Ocean Drive's packed nightclubs. It concealed a sudden, bone-chilling deletion of a human life that would leave the tropical metropolis paralyzed by dark theories for over a decade. It was the height of a scorching, rain-slick summer, a season characterized by blinding coastal downpours, flash floods, and the chaotic influx of global tourists chasing the ultimate sun-drenched fantasy, but inside a secluded, historic Spanish Revival estate nestled within the ultra-exclusive residential waterways of Coral Gables, a silent, meticulous execution was systematically carried out behind heavy hurricane shutters. 23-year-old oceanography student and high society heiress Bianca Sterling vanished completely from her private waterfront bedroom, leaving behind an eerie, undisturbed sanctuary that defied the logical boundaries of traditional criminal forensics. There was absolutely no forced entry on the reinforced wrought iron security doors, no fractured window panes, no scattered jewelry across the polished marble floors, and not a single foreign fingerprint detected on the heavy brass handles. The terrifyingly clean disappearance pointed directly to a phantom predator who moved through the high-security compound with absolute, intimate familiarity, an operator who understood the internal rhythm of the estate and knew precisely how to blind the state-of-the-art surveillance cameras that isolated the property from the rest of the world. Sirens wailed into the thick, moisture-laden night air as the first responding units raced through the iron gates, their flashing crimson lights reflecting off the dark pool waters. But a sudden tropical storm swept across the bay, washing away any transient trace of the abductor's exit and leaving an agonizing urban mystery that would instantly dominate local headlines as the most baffling Miami cold case of the millennium. Paranoia gripped the coastal elite like a physical vice as unconfirmed whispers exploded through the city's private yacht clubs and high-rise corporate boardrooms, suggesting that a brilliant, phantom-like predator was systematically targeting the youth of Miami's most influential dynasties, selecting victims with calculated perfection and dissolving into the dark Atlantic waters before the dawn could break. For more than a decade, that locked waterfront bedroom remained a frozen monument to investigative failure, a static capsule of unresolved trauma, while the official homicide investigation stalled, grew bitterly cold, and was eventually buried under the crushing weight of newer, louder coastal atrocities. But time in the subtropics does not erase secrets. It merely accelerates their rot from the inside out, waiting for a sudden, cataclysmic revelation to shatter a family's carefully manufactured reality all over again. Tonight, the 14-year silence is violently pulverized, the ancient, dust-choked evidence files are ripped from the dark basement archives of the police headquarters, and a horrifying discovery inside a hidden attic vault completely rewrites the history of a crime Miami could never forget, proving that the most lethal, blood-chilled monsters are often the ones who offer comfort in your hours of deepest despair. The exclusive, palm-fringed avenues of Coral Gables in the late summer of 2012 functioned as a literal fortress of structural privilege, a sprawling labyrinth of multi-million-dollar Mediterranean estates, private maritime docks, and around-the-clock security patrols where family reputations were guarded with a ferocious, legal intensity that bordered on absolute obsession. When Bianca Sterling dissolved into that elite, heavily monitored landscape without leaving a single microscopic thread of evidence behind, the structural illusion of security within Miami's upper crust was instantly incinerated, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of mutual suspicion, dark rumors, and unspoken accusations behind closed doors. Seasoned homicide detectives systematically canvassed every adjacent waterfront property, launching extensive, high-velocity interviews with prominent neighbors, luxury yacht captains, domestic staff workers, and high-profile socialites who frequented the family's weekend galas, searching desperately for a single pair of eyes that had tracked an anomalies along the dark canal waters. But the extensive canvassing yielded an absolute, frustrating zero. The overwhelming environmental white noise of localized thunder, humming air conditioning systems, and heavy holiday transit along the waterways had created a perfect sensory barrier that completely camouflaged the abduction. Forensic units combed through Bianca's private quarters for consecutive weeks, applying primitive digital extraction tools to her personal laptop data and searching for latent biological markers, stray clothing fibers, or hidden entry points that might suggest an uninvited presence. Every frantic tip that flooded the police hotline led to an immediate, devastating dead end. Every suspected internet stalker turned out to possess a verified, ironclad alibi. Every shadow captured by distant harbor security feeds remained a nameless phantom. The complete lack of physical evidence forced investigators to face a terrifying, internal hypothesis. They were dealing with an individual who possessed unrestricted key card access, someone who moved through the Sterling estate without triggering a single defensive reaction from Bianca or the family's sophisticated perimeter alarms. Months bled into grueling, silent years, and the initial frenzied energy of the investigation slowly cooled into the agonizing stagnation of a frozen folder, leaving Bianca's surviving relatives to drown in a perpetual purgatory of unspoken blame and mounting internal hostility. Her father, a dominant maritime logistics magnate, spent his vast fortunes hiring international private intelligence firms, refused to alter a single item inside her vacant bedroom, and kept a continuous, desperate vigil by the telephone until his sudden death, praying for a breakthrough that seemed increasingly impossible as the years marched relentlessly forward. The file grew thick with useless search warrants, dead-end leads, and heartbreaking letters from a community paralyzed by fear, before being boxed up, labeled, and buried in the basement archives of police headquarters. By the arrival of the mid-2020s, the Sterling disappearance had transitioned from an active investigation into a legendary, unresolvable mystery that defined the strict technological limitations of early 21st century forensics. The world outside the Coral Gables estate changed dramatically. Technology leaped forward, predictive data analytics evolved, and artificial intelligence-driven surveillance networks became ubiquitous, yet the evidence from 2012 remained locked in a state of absolute stasis, a static collection of glossy crime scene photographs and yellowed, handwritten notes. Generation after generation of cold case investigators would occasionally pull the dusty box from the dark shelves, staring at Bianca's smiling portrait against the backdrop of the ocean, searching for the microscopic flaw in the original timeline that had allowed a monster to escape into the free air. Paranoia within the coastal elite gradually faded into a distant, historical scar, but the trauma had permanently altered the security infrastructure of the city's wealthy enclaves, forcing the installation of high-definition thermal camera grids and automated license plate readers throughout the historic neighborhoods. Bianca's stepbrother, Julian Sterling, who had inherited the family's massive maritime empire and the sprawling Coral Gables brownstone estate, became a prominent public advocate for missing persons foundations, funding specialized private search task forces and keeping his sister's memory alive through highly publicized charity galas on the Bay. He consistently pressured the police department to apply newly developed forensic tools to the ancient physical evidence, presenting himself as a tireless, grieving crusader for justice who refused to let his sister's abductor rest easy. But without a fresh lead, a body, or a definitive forensic match, the state's case remained an unassailable fortress of doubt, a tragic puzzle waiting for a catalyst that no one could have possibly predicted. The catalyst did not emerge from a laboratory breakthrough, a sudden DNA database hit, or a meticulously planned police raid, but from the sterile, hushed confines of a hidden architectural void uncovered during a structural renovation in late 2025. A massive hurricane had swept through South Florida, causing significant roof damage to the historic Coral Gables mansion and forcing a team of structural restoration engineers to systematically tear down a sequence of water-damaged drywall panels deep within the master wing of the property. Behind a false ventilation shaft located at the highest point of the house, inside a completely unrecorded, insulated attic vault that was entirely invisible from the main hallways, the construction foreman shone his flashlight into the darkness, his beam illuminating a sight that instantly froze the blood in his veins. Resting on a dusty wooden beam lay a pristine, heavy-duty aluminum case, surrounded by a sequence of high-end surveillance monitors that were wired directly into the historic internal security lines of Bianca's bedroom below. The foreman scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs as he dialed the emergency homicide hotline, realizing that the secret attic discovery was about to blow the lid off a decade-long mystery and expose a horror that had been breathing directly above the family's heads for 14 years. The hidden attic vault was not a random storage space or a long-forgotten architectural oversight. It was a chilling, hyper-sophisticated operational nest, a voyeuristic observation bunker that had been meticulously designed to monitor Bianca Sterling's every move during the final months of her life. When the veteran cold case detectives and forensic trace technicians breached the hidden space under the glare of mobile floodlights, they uncovered an array of high-density digital video recorders, thermal imaging processors, and thousands of hours of illicitly captured footage that dated back to the exact spring of 2012. The text on the digital file labels revealed a terrifyingly organized daily log of her personal schedule, her private telephone conversations, and the precise times she entered sleep cycles. The discovery completely shattered 14 years of investigative assumptions, instantly redirecting the focus of the entire homicide unit away from external predators or coastal human trafficking syndicates, and pointing the finger directly at someone who possessed the unrestricted architectural freedom to build a secret surveillance fortress inside the home without ever drawing a single glance from the domestic staff. With sickening, cold-blooded precision, the digital files and physical items recovered from the aluminum case laid bare a timeline of familial obsession and calculated malice that completely destroyed the public persona of the family's golden boy. Investigators uncovered a series of hidden financial ledgers demonstrating that Julian Sterling had been systematically embezzling tens of millions of dollars from the family's maritime shipping business to fund highly illicit international real estate scams that were on the absolute verge of total exposure in August 2012. Bianca had recently discovered the fraudulent accounts through her own independent audit of her inheritance trust and had compiled a secure data disk to present to their father on the morning of August 15th. The banality of pure corporate greed and dark psychological obsession had fused into a lethal cocktail, transforming the brilliant oceanography student into an existential threat that needed to be permanently, silently eliminated before the sun could rise to expose Julian's financial ruin. The revelation grew increasingly horrific as modern forensic technicians applied newly developed, ultra-sensitive MVAC wet vacuum DNA collection systems to the interior linings of a heavy-duty, commercial-grade containment tarp that was found hidden beneath the attic floorboards. For 14 years, traditional forensic swabbing would have failed to extract a viable genetic profile from the synthetic material due to the intense humidity and degradation inside the roof space, but the modern fluid technology managed to penetrate deep into the porous structural weave, pulling microscopic skin cell material and low-density hair roots that had been trapped since 2012. The laboratory technicians worked around the clock, processing the fragile biological signature through high-density sequencers and running a direct comparison against the modern reference data. The digital monitors quickly confirmed the hidden attic's ultimate horror, revealing an absolute, undeniable match. The biological signature trapped within the operational nest belonged to Julian Sterling with a mathematical certainty of 1 in 7.8 billion. The immediate fallout from the forensic match triggered a massive, high-intensity tactical mobilization along the wealthy coastal channels of Miami, shattering the quiet morning peace of the exclusive yacht docks with the roaring arrival of black federal vehicles and state police cruisers. A specialized unit of heavily armed officers descended upon Julian Sterling's luxury megayacht as it prepared to depart from the marina, executing a high-priority arrest warrant that instantly brought down a 14-year campaign of public deception. Julian was taken into custody in his plush stateroom, surrounded by the very missing persons charity awards and community leadership plaques he had utilized as his ultimate psychological camouflage for over a decade. The news of his arrest sent an electric jolt of absolute disbelief and profound horror through the city of Miami, dominating every major media network under the Don DAP, rapid-fire banner. Miami 2012 cold case solved. Family crusader exposed as sister's abductor. For the remaining members of the Coral Gables social elite and the legal architects who had watched the folder gather dust for a generation, the sudden, shocking resolution brought an overwhelming wave of emotional vertigo that completely upended their reality. At the televised press conference later that afternoon, the chief of homicide displayed side-by-side images of Bianca's 2012 missing posters and Julian's modern booking photograph, exposing the terrifying dichotomy of a coastal predator who had used his sister's tragic disappearance to build an unassailable reputation as a public savior. The presentation shattered the city's remaining sense of safety, proving to a stunned public that no matter how deep a secret is buried behind wealth, prestige, and time, the modern weaponization of forensic genomics possesses an elemental, crushing force that can outlast the human heart. The psychological impact of the discovery completely transformed the community of Coral Gables, forcing citizens to confront the terrifying reality that a systematic killer had lived, worked, and governed high society charities in their midst for 14 years without ever drawing a single suspicious glance from the law. The case underscored a dark, historical truth about familial violence, exposing how an offender could leverage extreme wealth, trusted architectural access, and a highly sophisticated public relations campaign to camouflage a cold-blooded murder. As the heavy steel doors of the federal detention facility slammed shut behind Julian Sterling, the long, agonizing shadow of 2012 was officially, violently dispelled from the city. The secret attic vault that had haunted a dynasty for a generation had finally yielded its ultimate, stomach-turning truth, leaving behind a permanent, sobering reminder that justice can be delayed by a lifetime, but the code of human life cannot be permanently erased by time, and the voices of the dead will eventually find a way to demand absolute accountability in the blinding light of day. The grand jury presentation initiated under an ironclad shield of secrecy, but the shocking details leaking from the federal courthouse continued to paralyze the public consciousness like a nonstop, 24-hour loop of historical horror. Prosecutors systematically laid out the timeline, using the secret attic surveillance logs, the corporate bank records from 2012, and the mathematically indisputable DNA data to paint a picture of an apex predator who had spent his entire adult life playing the role of a grieving saint while holding the keys to his sister's virtual cage. Outside the granite walls, the permanent encampment of media trucks and citizens continued to swell to historic proportions, the entire nation watching the heavy glass doors for any sign of a final trial date that would permanently erase the freedom of the man who had outrun the law for a generation. Bianca Sterling's life had been violently stopped in the humid darkness of 2012, but 14 years later, the cold, unyielding mechanics of modern justice had finally forced the hidden attic vault to play its final, devastating note of absolute retribution. The legal machinery of the state of Florida moved with a sudden, crushing velocity that left Julian Sterling's highly compensated defense team completely paralyzed, their standard constitutional delaying tactics rendered entirely obsolete by the sheer mass of the scientific evidence. In the high-security holding cell beneath the courthouse, the 46-year-old billionaire sat slumped against the concrete wall, his tailored linen suit wrinkled, his dark hair disheveled, the mask of his aristocratic omnipotence completely shattered into nothingness. He was no longer the powerful shipping titan or the celebrated philanthropist. He was a trapped animal facing an unassailable mountain of forensic certainty that his money could not buy its way out of. The grand jury returned a swift, unanimous true bill of indictment for first-degree murder and kidnapping, ensuring that the trial of the century would proceed without a single corporate loophole to shield the ghost of his reputation from the blinding light of total public exposure. As the tropical rain began to fall over the Miami skyline once more, mimicking the exact atmospheric conditions of that fateful night in August 2012, a profound sense of historical finality settled over the Coral Gables estate. The heavy oak doors remained sealed, but the terrifying aura of mystery that had shrouded the property for 14 years had completely evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear reality of judicial triumph. For the cold case detectives who had dedicated their entire careers to chasing a phantom, the arrest was a historic validation of their unyielding persistence, a definitive proof that time possesses no shielding power when modern science decides to weaponize the truth against a monster. Bianca Sterling's voice would never read another oceanographic log, but the legal record of her victory was permanently etched into the history of the city, leaving behind an enduring, chilling lesson that the most lethal predators are not the ones lurking in the dark alleyways, but the ones who share your blood and smile at your success while planning your execution. The mechanical hum of the digital forensic preservation units inside the Miami-Dade Police Department's main laboratory vibrated through the sterile, fluorescent-lit air, filling the room with a heavy, clinical tension that stood in stark contrast to the tropical heat outside. For 14 years, the physical remnants of the Bianca Sterling disappearance had been locked inside a standard, cardboard evidence box, labeled as a permanent cold case file, and buried deep within the climate-controlled vaults of the county basement archives. To the casual observer, the faded plastic bags containing a digital camera memory card and a preserved silk ribbon were nothing more than tragic relics of a bygone era, static symbols of a night when the city's elite security systems had utterly failed. But as the state-of-the-art MVAC wet vacuum extraction system was meticulously prepared by a specialized unit of molecular geneticists, the physical geometry of a multi-million-dollar familial deception began to systematically unravel. The technical mechanics required to execute this modern forensic extraction without destroying the fragile, nearly decade-old biological material were incredibly complex, demanding a level of microscopic precision that was entirely science fiction in August 2012. Traditional forensic swabbing methods used at the turn of the millennium were only capable of collecting surface-level biological matter, completely missing the microscopic skin cells that became deeply embedded within the porous, woven matrix of materials during a violent physical struggle. The MVAC system, operating as a high-velocity, sterile fluid extraction device, utilized a specialized pressurized spray to gently dislodge the trapped cellular material from the deep fibers of items found within the secret attic bunker before immediately vacuuming the solution into a sterile collection chamber. Every square centimeter of the recovered materials was systematically scanned under intense ultraviolet light arrays, mapping out the precise physical touchpoints where the killer's hands had clamped down to extinguish the brilliant life of the young oceanographer. Outside the secure perimeter of the police headquarters, behind the double-layered rings of heavy yellow crime scene tape that blocked off the media access corridors, a massive sea of news trucks, legal analysts, and stunned Coral Gables residents braved the intense afternoon downpour. The sudden, explosive revelation that Julian Sterling, the billionaire maritime titan, the celebrated philanthropist, and the self-proclaimed public crusader for missing persons, had been arrested for the brutal execution of his own sister completely paralyzed the public consciousness. The narrative dominating every local and national television broadcast had violently shifted under the Don Dapp, rapid-fire banner. The waterfront predator. Miami 2012 cold case exploded. The case was no longer a historical mystery that belonged to the archives of a past decade. It had transformed into an active, bleeding systemic crisis that forced high society to re-examine its most prominent leaders through a lens of pure, unadulterated horror. Inside the secure digital forensics laboratory, the low, rhythmic whirring of the high-density genetic sequencers finally ceased, replaced by the sudden, sharp chime of a computer terminal indicating a complete data match. The lead forensic genomics expert, working in tandem with the multi-agency task force, stared at the high-definition monitor as the digital graphs locked into an indisputable, mirroring alignment. The biological signature pulled from the deep weave of the materials found in the hidden attic did not merely resemble the defendant's family tree, it matched Julian Sterling's modern, legally obtained reference profile with an absolute mathematical certainty of 1 in 7.8 billion. The data proved that while the tropical storm of 2012 had successfully deleted his physical footprints from the maritime docks of the mansion, it could not protect his microscopic biological signature from the unyielding, generational advance of modern molecular science. As the scientific link was solidified in the laboratory, a secondary, equally intense investigative offensive was unfolding inside the secure, heavily guarded interrogation suite at the federal courthouse, where elite cold case detectives were systematically dissecting the private financial ledger of the Sterling shipping empire from the early 2010s. The newly discovered attic surveillance logs had provided the initial, devastating roadmap, but it was the digital reconstruction of offshore banking records, hidden wire transfers, and fraudulent corporate loan applications that provided the ultimate, undeniable motive for the execution. Financial analysts uncovered a massive, clandestine network of illegal investment debts and failed international maritime speculations that had placed Julian Sterling on the absolute brink of total financial annihilation just days before Bianca vanished. The financial data revealed a chillingly calculated, cold-blooded timeline of desperation that completely destroyed the ironclad alibi Julian had presented to investigators 14 years prior. In August 2012, Julian had claimed to be attending an elite charity regatta across the bay at the exact hour his sister disappeared, a claim that was backed up by prominent socialites who remembered seeing him briefly during the crowded, chaotic event. But the digital reconstruction of cellular tower pings, private yacht GPS logs, and internal mansion security bypass codes proved that he had slipped away from the regatta during the height of the evening distractions, utilizing a high-speed tender boat to navigate the dark canal waters back to the Coral Gables mansion. He had entered through the unrecorded attic access panel, using his intimate knowledge of the home's blind spots to execute the crime, before calmly returning to the marina to ensure his presence was documented by the high society crowd. The psychological profile that emerged from the task force's deep dive was that of an incredibly disciplined, compartmentalized sociopath, a man who was capable of executing his own sister for financial preservation and then utilizing her tragic disappearance as a personal public relations platform to elevate his social status for more than a decade. By funding missing persons foundations, hosting massive charity events in Bianca's name, and publicly demanding justice from successive police chiefs, Julian had managed to position himself as the ultimate victim, completely insulated from suspicion by a wall of manufactured grief and extreme wealth. He had integrated his dark secrets so deeply into his ordinary, aristocratic routine that he had truly believed the law could never touch him, unaware that the silent, preserved surveillance gear in the hidden attic vault would eventually act as the ultimate forensic anchor to pull his empire of lies into the blinding light of public execution. Back outside the courthouse steps, a veteran investigative journalist who had followed the Sterling mystery since the first sirens wailed in 2012 stood before a wall of cameras, his face a portrait of profound weariness, but unyielding, investigative triumph. He detailed for the watching public how the extreme wealth and political influence of the Sterling dynasty had effectively paralyzed the original homicide investigation, creating a systemic barrier that traditional police work simply could not penetrate at the time of the disappearance. The money didn't buy safety forever, the journalist declared, his voice carrying an immense weight of authority that echoed through the crowded city streets. It bought 14 years of stolen luxury, 14 years of public praise, but it could not buy its way out of the math of human inheritance. The code of human life is spoken, the stone fortress has been breached, and the man who spent a lifetime hiding behind his sister's ghost is finally going to face the judgment of a jury of his peers. The digital clock on the wall of the state's attorney's high-security war room ticked past midnight, its steady, green glow illuminating a room that had become the clinical epicenter of a historic societal collapse. For 14 years, Julian Sterling had slept soundly within the gilded borders of Coral Gables, his multi-billion-dollar shipping empire shielded by a dense wall of political connections, high society charity checks, and a carefully manufactured image of deep, generational grief. But inside the sterile, paper-choked confines of the prosecution's headquarters, that shield was being systematically ground to dust beneath the weight of absolute, unassailable financial informatics. The Master Investigative Ledger, now officially indexed under the people of the state of Florida versus Julian Montgomery Sterling, had ceased to be an old missing persons case. It had transformed into a clinical, digital autopsy of a family dynasty built on a foundation of pure, cold-blooded asset elimination. The morning session of the task force's deep dive financial extraction initiated with the arrival of a massive, heavily encrypted data dump from maritime banks in Panama and the Cayman Islands. Under international forensic accounting treaties that had newly evolved by 2026, the state had successfully pierced the historic, double-blind anonymity of offshore shell corporations registered during the absolute summer of 2012. Analysts sat in focused silence as the data streams began to populate the room's high-definition projection monitors, converting a chaotic maze of ancient bank routings into a dawn-dap, rapid-fire timeline of ultimate desperation. The charts revealed that while Julian Sterling was publicly weeping at his sister's memorial service, his private, digital fingers were frantically shifting millions of dollars out of Bianca's trust accounts to satisfy a terrifying network of international creditors. The chief forensic accountant took the podium, his voice flat, analytical, and completely devoid of emotion as he walked the state prosecutors through the mathematical choreography of the murder motive. "Look at the absolute convergence of the dates," he stated, using a digital stylus to highlight a sharp, cascading drop in the Sterling corporate cash reserves during the final week of July 2012. Julian wasn't just facing a minor cash flow crunch. He had systematically leveraged the family's primary fleet assets as collateral to cover massive, unauthorized short positions on the international market. By August 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. He needed exactly $12.5 million in liquid capital before the banking grid opened on August 15th, or the entire Sterling name would be exposed as a fraudulent house of cards. The only asset capable of generating that level of instant mitigation was Bianca's independent, unencumbered trust fund, an asset she refused to sign over to him. The financial blueprints mapped perfectly over the recovered logs from the secret attic vault, creating an ironclad, multidimensional trap that left the defense table completely dead in the water. The data proved that on the afternoon of the disappearance, Bianca had initiated a secure, outbound electronic transmission to the family's primary corporate attorneys, requesting an emergency meeting for the following morning to formally strip Julian of his executive power over her financial interests. The banality of the greed was sickening. Bianca had been executed not by a mythical, shadow-dwelling international human trafficking cartel, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his own sister as a line-item liability that needed to be permanently deleted from the ledger before the financial markets could open to expose his ruin. While the financial task force was locking down the absolute motive, a secondary, highly intense forensic offensive was unfolding inside the state police microtrace analysis laboratory. Technicians were systematically utilizing advanced laser-induced fluorescence imaging to examine the original structural beams and insulation panels of the hidden attic vault, which had been permanently removed and preserved within climate-controlled storage facilities. At the time of the initial disappearance, primitive investigative tools had utterly failed to detect any usable evidence within the house, but the modern 2026 laser arrays managed to penetrate deep beneath the structural surfaces, isolating a microscopic sequence of low-density skin cell oils that mapped perfectly to Julian Sterling's right hand and forearm. The physical data proved with absolute, clinical certainty that someone had manually operated the hidden surveillance nest deep within the master wing of the property for consecutive months, leading up to the crime. The security logs recovered from the digital recording devices showed that the system utilized a highly restricted, master override protocol that was only accessible through Julian's private computer network. The defense's long-standing narrative that Julian was entirely unaware of the hidden attic's existence and that the surveillance bunker must have been constructed by an anonymous stalker was completely demolished by the physical reality of the internal system data. The shadow that operated the equipment in the dark ceiling of the mansion didn't need to break in. He owned the house, he controlled the network, and he moved with the absolute comfort of an executive who truly believed his status placed him completely above the reach of the law. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Miami-Dade courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a nonstop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Julian Sterling had spent more than a decade serving as the highly publicized face of missing persons charities, smiling for photographs with successive police chiefs while holding the keys to his sister's secret surveillance cage, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the families of other cold case victims who had looked to Julian as a beacon of hope, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. They sat in the war room through the long night hours, their eyes fixed on the digital display of Bianca's final, unrecorded oceanographic files, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the humid darkness of August 2012 was drawing down to its definitive, judicial reckoning. The secret attic vault that had stood as an invisible monument to familial deception for more than a decade was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and financial science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The humid Miami air hung heavy over the Biscayne Bay as the legal machinery of the state of Florida prepared to mount its most devastating systemic assault against Julian Sterling. It was now mid-2026, and the upcoming pretrial hearings had transformed the Miami-Dade Justice Building into a high-stakes fortress of media and state security. The prosecution team, flanked by digital analytics experts and elite homicide investigators, spent the midnight hours transforming Grand Jury Room 2 into a digital war theater. Behind them, massive high-definition monitors glowed with an absolute, DONDAP, rapid-fire sequence of banking transcripts, microcellular maps, and molecular structural breakdowns that stripped away the last remaining illusions of the defendant's innocence. Julian Sterling sat confined in a high-security holding block beneath the courthouse, his multi-billion-dollar legal team frantically scrambling to construct a constitutional defense against a mountain of truth that grew taller with every tick of the clock. The morning session initiated with a high-impact presentation by a pioneer in the field of forensic digital engineering and spatial reconstruction. The expert walked to the witness podium with a clinical, detached precision that instantly commanded the absolute attention of the presiding judge and the gathered legal correspondents. Behind him, the digital projection screens illuminated the darkened courtroom with a three-dimensional, pixel-perfect recreation of the Coral Gables estate as it existed on August 14, 2012. The software systematically integrated historical maritime weather data, the structural blueprints of the Spanish Revival Mansion, and the internal tracking data pulled from the Hidden Attics digital surveillance hub. With a flat, commanding authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, the digital expert demonstrated the physical impossibility of Julian Sterling's historical alibi. The defense had maintained for 14 years that Julian was physically present at an elite charity regatta across the bay during the critical 2-hour window when his sister disappeared from her bedroom. But the spatial animation mapped out a chillingly precise alternative choreography. The program tracked the digital footprint of Julian's private luxury tender boat, which had been automatically logged by an automated marine transponder reader near Key Biscayne at exactly 11:14 p.m. on the night of the disappearance, a route that led directly away from the regatta and straight toward the Coral Gables Canal network. The digital infrastructure of 2012 was complex, and it captured more than the defendant anticipated, the expert declared, his voice echoing clearly through the silent, packed gallery. The defendant operated under the assumption that because his name was logged on the manual attendance sheets of the regatta, his movements across the waterways were invisible. But the automated marine transit network captured his vessel's unique electronic signature heading north toward the private dock of the estate, and exactly 38 minutes later, the internal data recovered from the Hidden Attic documented a manual activation of the bedroom's secondary ventilation override. He did not need to force his way through the security gates. He moved through the waterways with the absolute, undisputed access of an operator who knew exactly how to manipulate his own home's infrastructure. The physical evidence presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when the prosecution team introduced the physical contents of the aluminum case recovered from the Hidden Attic vault into the official record. The original digital video storage drives from August 2012 sat beneath a thick pane of high-impact ballistic glass on the evidence cart, their data tracks serving as a devastating, multi-generational voice from the past. The prosecution's lead investigator read aloud a sequence of system access logs from the week leading up to the disappearance, detailing a terrifying pattern of hidden monitoring, unauthorized data copying, and financial tracking that had been completely concealed from the original investigators out of pure, calculated malice. The system logs exposed a series of intense, private data downloads performed from the Hidden Attic station, focusing entirely on Bianca's personal inheritance files and a secure audio recording she had captured on her laptop, a recording that documented Julian admitting to a massive, illegal corporate asset stripping scheme that threatened to destroy the family's entire shipping network. According to the recovered logs, Julian had accessed this file just hours before Bianca vanished, realizing that she had successfully compiled the evidence required to bring his financial fraud to light. The banality of the greed was sickening. Bianca had been targeted and eliminated not by an anonymous international trafficking cartel or a transient coastal burglar, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his own sister as an existential threat to his freedom and his multi-million-dollar lifestyle. The weight of the technical data and physical testimony completely locked the legal vice around the defense, leaving Julian Sterling's high-profile attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver during their cross-examination phase. They attempted to launch a desperate line of questioning regarding the structural integrity of the hidden attic space, suggesting that the surveillance equipment could have been planted or accessed by disgruntled former employees seeking to sabotage the shipping dynasty. But the prosecution counterattacked immediately, introducing an array of forensic network dating reports and biometric fingerskin analyses that solidified the absolute authenticity of the system operations, effectively cutting off the defense's last remaining exit route and rendering their arguments entirely obsolete before the eyes of the court. Outside the heavy granite walls of the courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live updates under the Dawn DAP, Rapid Fire banner, The Waterfront Predator, Miami 2012 Cold Case Solved. The viral true crime broadcasts and digital analytical streams had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding the absolute immunity that extreme wealth and corporate influence had bought during the early 21st century. The realization that Julian Sterling had spent 14 years serving as the highly publicized face of missing persons foundations, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the key to his sister's digital cage, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the investigators who had refused to let Bianca's file fade into a historical footnote, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. They sat in the gallery through the long hours of the pre-trial hearings, their eyes fixed on the empty glass witness box, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the humid darkness of August 2012 was drawing down to its definitive, judicial reckoning. The secret attic vault that had stood as an invisible sanctuary of malice for more than a decade was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, corporate shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The heavy, tropical downpour outside the Miami-Dade Justice Building did nothing to cool the intense, scientific heat radiating within the secure walls of Courtroom 302 as the afternoon session of the pretrial hearings shifted into a phase of pure, biological confrontation. The defense table, once an unassailable fortress of corporate wealth and elite legal strategy, was visibly trembling under the weight of the upcoming molecular presentation. The multi-agency task force, operating under the master rubric of the Miami 2012 Cold Case Solved, was no longer relying on old investigative assumptions or 10-year-old circumstantial alibis. They were preparing to deliver the ultimate, definitive blow to Julian Sterling's freedom through the absolute, clinical application of modern forensic genomics and cellular matrix reconstruction. The state's lead molecular geneticist took the witness stand with a detached, clinical precision that instantly commanded the attention of the court. She carried a thick, white digital binder containing the comprehensive, multispectral DNA sequencing analysis pulled from the internal linings of the commercial-grade containment tarp found hidden beneath the attic floorboards. Behind her, the massive digital projection screen illuminated the darkened room, displaying a highly detailed, three-dimensional molecular map of the synthetic material's weave, overlaid with contrasting bands of bright crimson and electric blue light that mapped out the precise touchpoints of a violent physical concealment. With a flat, authoritative tone that cut through the defensive legal posture of the courtroom, the geneticist walked the court through the mathematical certainty of the modern MVAC wet vacuum extraction results. She demonstrated how the advanced system had bypassed the surface-level limitations of primitive early 2010s forensic swabbing, penetrating deep into the internal core of the synthetic matrix to isolate 42 distinct, low-density skin cell clusters that had been permanently trapped for over a decade. The original investigators were limited by the tools of their era, searching only for visible blood indicators or high-volume fluids, which were entirely absent from this meticulously cleaned estate, the geneticist stated, her voice echoing clearly through the silent gallery. But modern molecular forensics operates on a cellular level. What we are looking at on this screen is not a random environmental transfer or a trick of coincidental handling. This is an intense, localized sequence of epithelials left behind at the exact moment a high-intensity physical containment was carried out. The scientific presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when the geneticist activated the comparative genetic profile overlay, displaying the exact matching sequences of short tandem repeats and single nucleotide polymorphisms pulled from both the containment material and Julian Sterling's modern reference sample. The digital bars locked into a flawless, mirroring alignment, destroying any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared regarding potential laboratory contamination or familial DNA cross-reactivity. The mathematical probability of this specific biological profile belonging to any other living human being on the face of this earth is exactly 1 in 7.8 billion, the geneticist declared, her gaze locking firmly onto the lead defense attorney. This is Julian Sterling's permanent, indelible biological signature, left behind at the center of a hidden crime scene and preserved by time until the world developed the science necessary to decode his operations. The weight of the genomics data completely paralyzed the defense table, leaving Julian's high-profile attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver during their brief, desperate cross-examination phase. They attempted to shift their focus toward a technical challenge regarding the private laboratory's digital storage protocols, suggesting a potential chain of custody vulnerability that should retroactively taint the physical fruit of the investigation. But the prosecution counterattacked immediately, introducing an array of state-validated forensic tracking logs that solidified the absolute purity of the evidence pipeline, effectively cutting off the defense's last remaining constitutional exit route and rendering their arguments entirely obsolete before the eyes of the court. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the courtroom was plunged into a heavy, emotional silence as the lead prosecutor rose to deliver the state's final pretrial summation, a Don Dapp, rapid-fire sequence of proof that felt like the slow, crushing closing of a vice around the defendant's life. The prosecutor did not read from notes. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the presentation floor, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the collective gravity of an entire city that had spent 14 years searching the coastal channels for an answer. He pointed a heavy, trembling finger directly across the room at the quiet, 46-year-old billionaire sitting in the tailored linen suit. For 14 years, Julian Sterling believed his wealth made him smarter than the law, smarter than the science, and smarter than the very community he systematically exploited and betrayed, the prosecutor declared, his words cutting through the stillness like a hammer cracking stone. He hid his malice behind a smile, behind philanthropic maritime donations, and behind the stolen memory of his brilliant sister. But the truth is an elemental force. It does not forget, it does not decay, and it does not stay buried forever beneath a fortress of privilege. The secret attic has spoken. The digital surveillance logs have been vindicated, and the ghosts of his past are standing right behind him demanding their final, absolute measure of justice. The defense team sat in a state of frozen, collective exhaustion as the judge retired to her chambers to draft the final trial orders, a visceral realization settling over the courtroom that the legal shield of the Sterling dynasty had been permanently shattered into nothingness. Outside the heavy granite walls of the courthouse, the permanent media encampment had swollen to an unprecedented, historic magnitude, a sea of flashing satellite lights, television cameras, and silent crowds of citizens who stood huddled together under a canopy of raincoats, waiting for the final trial date that would permanently rewrite the history of modern American justice. A lone figure stood prominently at the front of the gates, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding resolve, his eyes fixed firmly on the courthouse doors as the legal machinery of the state prepared to permanently lock away the monster who had spent a lifetime building an empire of luxury on the foundation of a silent execution in the dark roof of his own home. The dense, humid atmosphere inside Grand Jury Room 2 of the Miami-Dade Justice Building remained completely unyielding as the pretrial hearings entered their second grueling week. Outside, The early summer tropical storm of June 2026 pelted against the reinforced glass windows, but inside, the focus was trained entirely on a cold case from 2012 that was rapidly thawing under the relentless flame of modern forensic informatics. The defense table, which had initially projected an aura of unassailable corporate invincibility, now looked like a command center under a state of permanent siege. Julian Sterling sat motionless in his customized high-back chair, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, his aristocratic posture slowly compressing under the weight of an escalating, multi-layered digital and physical dragnet. The morning session initiated with a high-stakes, rapid-fire presentation by a special agent of the FBI's Cyberforensics Division, who had been permanently attached to the multi-agency task force. The agent carried a secure, government-encrypted solid-state drive containing the complete, restored digital architecture of the Sterling shipping conglomerate's internal server files from the final month of the summer of 2012. Behind her, the massive multi-panel presentation wall illuminated the darkened room, displaying a complex, interlocking network of red and white data streams that mapped out a hidden landscape of corporate espionage, systemic asset stripping, and catastrophic financial fraud. With a flat, authoritative precision that instantly severed any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared, the agent walked the court through the chronological anatomy of Julian Sterling's desperation. She demonstrated how the defendant had systematically exploited his executive access to the family's primary maritime development funds to finance an aggressive, highly illicit offshore speculation scheme involving high-risk digital currency prototypes and unregulated international ports. When the global maritime markets experienced a sharp, unpredicted correction in early August 2012, Julian's entire financial structure collapsed like a house of cards, exposing him to an immediate, multi-million-dollar deficit that would have triggered an automatic federal investigation and permanent disinheritance by his family. The financial records we have recovered from the legacy servers do not show a routine corporate misstep, the agent stated, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the legal murmurs of the gallery. They document a highly disciplined, desperate scramble for absolute survival. By Monday, August 13, 2012, the international banking syndicates had issued an absolute 24-hour ultimatum to liquidate his positions or face immediate exposure. The only liquid asset within the entire family portfolio that possessed the exact valuation necessary to stop the financial execution was Bianca Sterling's independent, unencumbered musical and oceanographic trust fund. What the original investigators treated as a tragic, random disappearance by an anonymous coastal predator was, in absolute reality, a highly calculated, cold-blooded corporate liquidation executed to preserve an inheritance. The digital presentation shifted from the macroeconomic fraud to the intimate, microforensic tracking of the family mansion's internal network routing on the night of the crime. Technicians had utilized advanced, multispectral signal reconstruction to isolate a sequence of deleted digital data packets from the estate's primitive late 2010s private server switchboard. The restored data logs revealed a terrifying, unrecorded detail. At exactly 11:14 p.m. on August 14th, less than 2 hours before her disappearance, Bianca Sterling had initiated an emergency, secure data transmission to her personal attorney's home office, attempting to route a digitized data folder containing an explicit record of Julian admitting to the corporate embezzlement. The discovery of this digital trace completely locked the vice around the defense, providing a devastating, mathematically precise timeline that mapped perfectly over the recovered files from the secret attic vault. The data proved that Julian's sudden return to the Coral Gables mansion from the charity regatta was not a casual or coincidental movement. He had received an automated digital alert on his encrypted smartphone indicating that Bianca was actively accessing the corporate mainframe from her private waterfront bedroom. The banality of the corporate surveillance was stomach-turning. Bianca had been monitored, targeted, and eliminated by her own stepbrother not because of a sudden burst of familial rage, but because she had successfully compiled the digital evidence required to destroy his life of luxury. To solidify this timeline beyond a shadow of a single scientific doubt, the prosecution team called a senior trace analyst to the witness stand. The analyst was responsible for the physical examination of the original digital surveillance recorders that had been recovered from the secret attic bunker during the secondary task force sweep in early 2026. Under the high-powered magnification of a scanning electron microscope, the analyst displayed the internal circuit board of the primary recording unit, pointing out a series of microscopic, high-intensity fracture lines along the primary storage controller that indicated it had been violently forcibly modified and hidden to conceal its internal operations. Using advanced magnetic force microscopy, the trace unit had managed to read the residual, subsurface data domains left behind on the fragmented storage chips that had survived the concealment. The digital reconstruction, though heavily compressed by decades of environmental exposure and physical isolation inside the roof space, filled the silent courtroom with a low, gravelly, unmistakable sequence of commands that caused the color to completely drain from Julian Sterling's face. The data logs captured a brief, chaotic segment of the final remote commands executed from the hidden attic station, a manual override of the home's climate control system to blind the local heat sensors, followed by a definitive, remote lock command executed on Bianca's private bedroom door just seconds before the surveillance feeds cut into static. The weight of the restored digital tracking data completely paralyzed the defense table, reducing Julian's high-priced legal team to a state of absolute silence as the afternoon session drew to its close. They attempted to launch a minor constitutional motion to suppress the network reconstruction results, claiming that the physical age of the storage chips rendered any modern digital extraction inherently speculative and unscientific. But the presiding judge denied the motion immediately from the bench, ruling that the science behind the subsurface data reconstruction was fully validated under modern federal evidentiary standards, effectively sealing the historical record and leaving the defendant completely exposed to the upcoming jury selection phase. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, the public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live digital analytical streams under the Dawn DAP banner. The Digital Trap, Miami 2012 cold case closed. The viral true crime broadcasts and continuous live feeds had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding the absolute immunity that extreme wealth and corporate influence had bought during the early 21st century. The realization that Julian Sterling had spent 14 years serving as the highly publicized face of missing persons charities, smiling for photographs with successive police chiefs while holding the key to his sister's digital cage, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the investigative journalists who had followed the Sterling mystery since the first sirens wailed in the humid darkness of August 2012, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. They sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, their eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the storm-slicked streets of Coral Gables was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The secret attic vault that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for more than a decade was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, corporate shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Miami's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The scorching midsummer sun of late June 2026 beat down relentlessly on the heavy limestone facade of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, but inside the secure, climate-controlled confines of Courtroom 302, the air was chilled to an icy, absolute freeze. The transition from the high-stakes pre-trial technical hearings into the formal commencement of the trial phase marked a profound, historic shift in the legal history of South Florida. For 14 years, the elite social circles of Coral Gables had whispered about the phantom that had violently dissolved Bianca Sterling from her waterfront estate, treating her disappearance as a mythical, tragic urban legend that defied the boundaries of modern coastal policing. But on this morning, the illusion of safety, prestige, and permanent billionaire immunity was completely stripped away as the state prepared to seat the final members of the jury panel, turning the judicial theater into an unyielding, Don Dapp engine of absolute forensic accountability. The master trial docket, officially registered under the Administrative Code the State of Florida versus Julian Montgomery Sterling, stood as an unprecedented landmark in modern criminal jurisprudence. This was not a routine trial designed to litigate an emotional confession or debate a collection of circumstantial witness sightings. It had evolved into a clinical, technologically weaponized tribunal, a multi-generational prosecution of an aristocratic sociopath whose entire adult life had been a masterclass in psychological camouflage and corporate image manipulation. The lead prosecutor stood at the podium with a calm, predatory focus, his dark-tailored suit matching the solemn gravity of the binders stacked across the presentation tables. Behind him, the digital monitors hummed with a low electronic frequency, ready to project a devastating array of molecular, financial, and digital certainties that would systematically grind Julian Sterling's 14-year lie into absolute dust. The morning session initiated with a definitive presentation of the state's opening statement, a Don Dapp, rapid-fire narrative that immediately pinned the newly seated jurors to their high-backed leather chairs. The prosecutor did not look at a notepad or rely on standard legal rhetoric. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the presentation floor, his voice carrying a flat, commanding resonance that instantly cut through the dense corporate atmosphere of the courtroom. He traced the timeline of August 14, 2012, with surgical precision, mapping out the cold reality of familial elimination that had been carried out beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Coral Gables mansion while the rest of the city was distracted by the roaring celebrations of the summer season. We are not here to ask this panel to solve a mystery, or to sift through a collection of vague memories and old police hunches, the prosecutor stated, his eyes locking directly onto the faces of the jurors. We are here to present a mathematical equation of absolute guilt, written in the permanent, indelible language of modern forensic science and offshore financial informatics. Julian Sterling believed that because he possessed billions of dollars, because he controlled a vast maritime shipping empire, and because he spent more than a decade funding missing persons foundations, he had successfully outrun the reach of Florida justice. He believed that the tropical storm of 2012 had permanently deleted his footprints from the maritime docks of his sister's home. But the science does not compromise, it does not recognize the passage of time, and it does not bow to the political influence of the elite. The physical assets recovered from his secret attic surveillance nest have spoken, and the code of his own life has trapped him in a vice from which his wealth cannot buy an exit. The state's opening salvo moved systematically from the macro concept of the murder motive to the physical reality of the evidence sitting beneath the laboratory lights. One by one, senior forensic trace analysts and cybercrime experts were called forward to introduce the foundational components of the state's master archive into the trial record. The focus shifted to the physical presence of the aluminum case recovered from the hidden attic vault, which was placed prominently on the central evidence cart, its pristine, metallic surface serving as a chilling, technological voice from the past. The prosecution read a sequence of system access logs from the summer of 2012, detailing a terrifying pattern of hidden monitoring, unauthorized data copying, and financial tracking that had been completely concealed from the original investigators out of pure, calculated malice. The presentation grew increasingly intense as the prosecution introduced the comprehensive financial tracking data newly unsealed by international regulatory authorities. Analysts demonstrated how the defendant had systematically leveraged the family's primary fleet assets as collateral to cover massive, unauthorized short positions on the international market, creating a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar deficit that threatened to trigger an automatic federal fraud investigation and permanent disinheritance by his family. The financial data revealed a chillingly calculated, cold-blooded timeline of desperation that completely destroyed the alibi Julian had presented to investigators 14 years prior. By August 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. Julian needed exactly $12.5 million before the banking grid opened the following morning, and the only liquid asset capable of generating that level of instant mitigation was Bianca's independent, unencumbered trust fund, an asset she had definitively refused to sign over to him. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a nonstop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Julian Sterling had spent 14 years serving as the highly publicized face of Missing Persons Foundations, smiling for photographs with successive police chiefs while holding the key to his sister's digital cage, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the investigative journalists who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. They sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, his eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the humid darkness of August 2012 was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The secret attic vault that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for more than a decade was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Miami's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The rhythmic tapping of the court stenographer's machine was the only sound cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of courtroom 302 as the prosecution's financial task force prepared to deliver its most critical blow. It was late June 2026, and the trial of the state of Florida versus Julian Montgomery Sterling had entered its most clinical phase. The corporate armor that had shielded the 46-year-old billionaire for more than a decade was no longer merely being scratched. It was being systematically dismantled, piece by digital piece, before a jury that sat in frozen, absolute concentration. The state was no longer relying on old investigative notes or 14-year-old circumstantial theories. They were introducing a devastating, dawn-dap stream of forensic informatics that transformed a cold-blooded familial execution into a mathematically indisputable certainty. The lead forensic accountant took the witness stand, carrying an encrypted state-issued hard drive containing the completely restored digital architecture of the Sterling shipping conglomerate's legacy banking records from the summer of 2012. Behind her, the massive multi-panel presentation wall illuminated the darkened courtroom, displaying a complex, interlocking matrix of international bank routings, wire transfers, and margin call notices. The visual data converted a chaotic maze of offshore corporate maneuvers into a direct, linear timeline of ultimate desperation, mapping out the precise financial choreography that had led Julian Sterling to cross the distance between a high society charity regatta and his sister's private waterfront bedroom on the night of August 14, 2012. With a flat, clinical authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, the accountant walked the jury through the macroeconomic reality of the defendant's collapse. She demonstrated how Julian had systematically leveraged the family's core shipping assets as secret collateral to fund an aggressive, highly illicit offshore speculation loop involving unregulated international ports. When the global maritime markets experienced a sharp, unpredicted correction in early August 2012, Julian's entire financial empire collapsed like a house of cards, exposing him to an immediate $12.5 million deficit that would have triggered an automatic federal fraud investigation and permanent disinheritance by his family the very next morning. The financial records we have recovered from the Panama and Cayman Islands legacy servers do not document a routine corporate misstep or a simple cash flow crunch, the accountant stated, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the legal murmurs of the gallery. They document a highly disciplined, desperate scramble for absolute survival. By the afternoon of August 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. The defendant had less than 12 hours to secure the liquidation of a multi-million-dollar asset before the banking grid opened on August 15th. The only unencumbered asset within the entire family portfolio that possessed that exact valuation was Bianca Sterling's independent oceanographic and trust fund, an asset she had definitively and repeatedly refused to sign over to him. The financial blueprints mapped perfectly over the recovered records from the secret attic vault, creating an ironclad, multi-dimensional trap that completely eliminated the defense's ability to launch a plausible counter-narrative. The data proved that at exactly 4:12 p.m. on the afternoon of the disappearance, Bianca had initiated a secure, recorded electronic transmission to the family's primary estate attorneys, requesting an emergency board meeting for the following morning to formally strip Julian of his executive power over her financial interests and expose his fraud to their family. The banality of the greed was stomach-turning. Bianca had been monitored and targeted within her own home not because of a sudden burst of sibling rage, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his own sister as a liability that needed to be permanently deleted from the ledger to preserve his lifestyle of stolen luxury. The presentation grew increasingly intense as the prosecution shifted its focus from the macroeconomic motive to the micro-trace physical evidence that had been pulled from the secret attic bunker itself. A senior trace analyst took the stand, displaying a series of high-resolution digital scans that utilized advanced laser-induced fluorescence imaging to examine the original structural beams and insulation panels of the hidden vault. At the time of the initial disappearance, primitive investigative tools had utterly failed to detect any usable evidence within the house, but the modern 2026 laser arrays managed to penetrate deep beneath the surfaces, isolating a microscopic sequence of low-density skin cell oils that mapped perfectly to Julian Sterling's right hand and forearm. The physical data proved with absolute, clinical certainty that someone had manually operated the hidden surveillance nest deep within the master wing of the property for consecutive months leading up to the crime. The security logs recovered from the digital recording devices showed that the system utilized a highly restricted, master override protocol that was only accessible through Julian's private computer network. The defense's long-standing narrative that Julian was entirely unaware of the hidden attic's existence and that the surveillance bunker must have been constructed by an anonymous stalker was completely demolished by the physical reality of the internal system data. The shadow that operated the equipment in the dark ceiling of the mansion didn't need to break in. He owned the house, he controlled the network, and he moved with the absolute comfort of an executive who truly believed his status placed him completely above the reach of the law. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a nonstop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Julian Sterling had spent 14 years serving as the highly publicized face of missing persons foundations, smiling for photographs with successive police chiefs while holding the key to his sister's digital cage, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the investigative journalists who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, his eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the humid darkness of August 2012 was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The secret attic vault that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for more than a decade was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Miami's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The sterile, high-voltage hum of the court's digital display network seemed to grow louder as Courtroom 302 descended into its most technically ruthless phase of testimony. It was the afternoon of June 28, 2026, and the trial of the state of Florida versus Julian Montgomery Sterling had stripped away the last remaining layers of high society pretense, leaving only the cold, unyielding mechanics of modern molecular biology to dictate the final narrative of the 2012 Coral Gables execution. The defense team, which had spent more than a decade relying on an ironclad wall of political influence, expensive public relations management, and primitive forensic limitations, sat in absolute, frozen isolation as the prosecution called its pinnacle scientific witness to the stand. The state's lead molecular geneticist stepped up to the witness podium with a slow, deliberate precision that signaled the absolute end of speculative legal maneuvering. She carried a single, heavily encrypted digital ledger containing the multispectral DNA sequencing matrices that had been pulled directly from the internal linings of the commercial-grade containment tarp found hidden beneath the attic floorboards. Behind her, the massive digital projection screens flickered to life, displaying a high-definition, three-dimensional topological map of the synthetic material's fibers. The display was overlaid with a DON-DAP, rapid-fire sequence of high-contrast genetic bar graphs, casting a pale, clinical blue light across the pale, drawn faces of the 12 jurors. With a flat, commanding authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, the geneticist initiated her breakdown of the modern MVAC wet vacuum recovery process. She detailed how the specialized forensic apparatus had utilized a pressurized, sterile solution to penetrate deep beneath the surface layers of the synthetic matrix, dislodging ancient, trapped epithelial skin cells that traditional cotton swabs had completely failed to capture at the time of the initial disappearance. The digital map systematically traced 42 separate, low-density cellular clusters that had been embedded into the porous weave of the material during the intense, violent friction of a physical struggle. The original forensic teams in August 2012 were looking for visible biological fluids, blood, heavy saliva, or high-volume sweat stains, which were completely absent from this pristine crime scene, the geneticist declared, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the stifling courtroom air like a scalpel. But modern molecular forensics does not require a visible stain to establish an absolute physical connection. What we have successfully extracted from the deep weave of this material is the permanent, microscopic cellular residue of the killer's hands. When an individual applies the immense physical force required to execute a physical containment, their skin cells are violently sheared off and ground into the material matrix, effectively creating an indelible, biological blueprint of the assault. The scientific presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when the geneticist activated the comparative genomic profile overlay on the central projection screens. The digital monitors displayed a side-by-side alignment of the short tandem repeat configurations and single nucleotide polymorphisms pulled from the containment material alongside the modern, legally mandated reference profile obtained from Julian Sterling following his arrest. One by one, the 24 distinct genetic markers locked into a flawless, mirroring alignment, destroying any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared regarding potential environmental contamination, historical laboratory mishandling, or random familial DNA cross-reactivity. The mathematical reality of this scientific match is absolute and entirely unassailable, the geneticist stated, turning her gaze directly toward the jury box. The probability of this specific genetic profile belonging to any other living human being on the face of this planet is exactly 1 in 7.8 billion. This data does not present a statistical suggestion or a vague circumstantial association. It is a definitive molecular identification. The microscopic cells trapped within this hidden structural vault for 14 years belong to the defendant, Julian Sterling, proving with mathematical certainty that his hands were the ultimate instrument of his sister's destruction. The sheer weight of the genomic mapping completely paralyzed the defense table, reducing Julian's high-priced legal architects to a state of absolute, visible defeat. Their pre-planned cross-examination strategy, which had relied on trying to aggressively confuse the jury with technical jargon and procedural obfuscation, was instantly rendered entirely obsolete by the unyielding precision of the molecular math. When given the opportunity to question the witness, the lead defense attorney could only offer a few brief, halting queries regarding the exact temperature controls of the evidence archive, which the geneticist effortlessly dismantled by producing a complete, digitally verified log of the climate-controlled storage vault spanning back to the recovery operation. Outside the heavy granite architecture of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, the public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live digital analytical streams under the Don Dapp banner. The molecular execution, Julian Sterling's genetic code trapped. The viral true crime broadcasts and continuous investigative specials had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding corporate security protocols and the historical immunity that extreme wealth had bought during the early 21st century. The realization that a systematic killer had navigated the highest echelons of Miami society for more than a decade, building an empire of public philanthropy on the foundation of a cold-blooded familial execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For the investigative journalists who sat silently in the front row of the gallery, his face a mask of absolute physical exhaustion but complete, unshakable peace, the relentless Don Dapp delivery of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional release that transitioned the clinical parameters of a legal victory into a historic milestone. The long, agonizing journey that had initiated with the wail of sirens in the humid darkness of August 2012 was drawing down to its definitive, historical destination, proving to a watching world that while a predator can use thousands of tons of corporate wealth, political shields, and time to build a fortress of secrecy, the modern weaponization of forensic genomics possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The grand jury room sat in a state of frozen concentration as the state prepared to rest its master case, leaving the final fate of Miami's most sophisticated aristocratic predator permanently in the hands of 12 citizens who had looked directly into the face of absolute truth. The low, structural hum of courtroom 302's climate control system was the only sound left to fill the suffocating silence as the final gavel of the defense's cross-examination phase echoed off the walnut-paneled walls. It was the afternoon of June 28, 2026, and the trial of the state of Florida versus Julian Montgomery Sterling had reached its ultimate, definitive breaking point. The corporate mythology, the years of high society philanthropic posturing, and the multi-million-dollar legal shields that had insulated the 46-year-old real estate and shipping tycoon for 14 long years were entirely gone, ground to absolute dust beneath the Don Dapp, rapid-fire presentation of molecular math, and digital forensic informatics. The defense table sat in a state of frozen, collective paralysis, their arguments completely exhausted, their alternative theories rendered utterly obsolete by the unyielding precision of the state's master biological archive. The lead prosecutor slowly rose from his seat at the state's table, adjusting the cuffs of his dark charcoal suit before stepping out onto the center of the courtroom floor. He carried no notes, no presentation clickers, and no legal binders. His movements were slow, deliberate, and carried the immense, crushing weight of a multi-agency task force that had spent more than a decade chasing a phantom through the highest echelons of Miami's elite. He walked along the perimeter of the jury box, his eyes locking directly onto the faces of the 12 citizens who had sat through weeks of technical genomic mapping and historical financial audits, their expressions drawn tight with a profound sense of historical responsibility. When the prosecutor spoke, his voice did not carry the standard theatrical volume of a traditional closing argument. It dropped to a flat, clinical, gravelly whisper that seemed to vacuum the remaining oxygen directly out of the room. For 14 years, a silent executioner walked the avenues of Coral Gables, the prosecutor initiated, his hand gesturing vaguely toward the heavy glass windows that overlooked the sweltering Miami skyline. For 14 years, the elite institutions of this city hosted regattas, signed charity checks, and shook hands with a man who claimed to be a crusader for the forgotten, a public savior who wept openly for the tragic, unsolved loss of his brilliant sister, Bianca Sterling. But as you look across this courtroom today, the illusion of that public saint is entirely gone. The science has stripped away the tailored suits, the corporate titles, and the political alliances, leaving us face to face with the raw, calculated reality of a predator who viewed his own family as nothing more than a line-item liability to be permanently liquidated in the dark. The prosecutor turned sharply on his heel, his finger pointing with absolute, unyielding violence directly across the room at Julian Sterling, who sat slumped forward in his leather chair, his dark hair disheveled, the mask of his aristocratic omnipotence completely shattered into nothingness. The defense has spent days trying to convince you that this case is too complex, that the evidence is too old, and that the timeline is too obscured by the fog of a past decade to find absolute certainty, the prosecutor declared, his voice rising in a steady, dawn-dap crescendo that vibrated through the studio-quality recording arrays of the courtroom. They want you to believe that a mythical, international human trafficking cartel scaled the walls of that estate or bypassed an advanced security grid without triggering a single alarm, executing a brilliant student for absolutely no logistical reason. But the data we have entered into this permanent record does not trade in myths, it does not rely on old police hunches, and it does not compromise with extreme wealth. Behind the prosecutor, the massive digital projection screens flickered to life for the final time, displaying a high-contrast, side-by-side alignment of the secret attic surveillance logs from August 2012 and the modern MVAC molecular sequencing charts. The visual intersection was devastatingly absolute. The exact hour Julian's private vessel transponder was logged by an automated marine reader near Key Biscayne mapped perfectly over the internal system bypass codes used to deactivate the mansion's secondary ventilation override. The math of human identity does not lie, the prosecutor stated, his voice dropping back to a low, rhythmic cadence that pinned the jurors to their seats. The digital legacy servers from Panama and the Cayman Islands have documented the absolute motive, a $12.5 million corporate deficit that was closing in on the defendant like a physical vice. Bianca held the key to his financial execution. She possessed the data files documenting his fraud, and she requested an emergency board meeting to formally strip him of his executive power. He didn't cross the waterways that night to visit his sister. He crossed the waterways to eliminate a witness and secure an empire of stolen luxury. The prosecution's closing narrative reached its absolute, suffocating peak when the prosecutor walked over to the climate-controlled evidence cart, pointing directly at the aluminum case recovered from the hidden attic vault. The defense wants you to believe that the microscopic cells pulled from this hidden space could have been transferred by a casual encounter, an environmental cross-contamination, or a trick of structural exposure, the prosecutor argued, his gaze unblinking as he stared down the lead defense counsel. But the genomic mapping has proved that these epithelial clusters were ground deep into the internal matrix of the materials by a physical force that exceeded hundreds of pounds of pressure, a force that accompanied a cold-blooded physical concealment. The probability of those cells belonging to anyone else on this earth is 1 in 7.8 billion. That is not a statistical anomaly. That is Julian Sterling's permanent, indelible biological signature, trapped within the hidden sanctuary of his crime for 14 years until the world developed the molecular science required to decode his monstrosity. The prosecutor paused, letting the absolute mathematical certainty of the genomic data settle over the room like a heavy block of ice. He walked back to the center of the presentation floor, his hands resting flat against the wooden railing of the jury box, his voice carrying a final, deep wave of emotional gravity that cut through the clinical atmosphere of the court. Bianca Sterling's voice was violently, permanently silenced in the humid darkness of August 2012, the prosecutor whispered, his eyes scanning the faces of the 12 citizens who held the final, permanent fate of the Sterling dynasty in their hands. But the code of human life possesses an elemental, crushing force that outlasts the human heart, outlasts the stone walls of a Coral Gables estate, and outlasts the lifetime of a billionaire predator. The secret attic vault has yielded its truth. The digital surveillance logs have been vindicated, and the voices of the dead have finally broken through 14 years of silence to demand their account. The state has rested its case. The math is absolute. The timeline is locked. We ask you to return the only verdict that honors the unyielding march of human justice. Find the defendant, Julian Montgomery Sterling, guilty of first-degree murder. As the prosecutors stepped back to the state's table, a profound, historic stillness descended upon courtroom 302, the heavy oak doors closing behind the jury panel as they retired to initiate their deliberations. Outside the granite architecture of the Miami-Dade Justice Building, the public paralyzation had reached an unprecedented, historic magnitude. Thousands of media trucks, true crime digital analysts, and ordinary citizens stood huddled together along the boiling pavement of the city streets, their eyes fixed firmly on the massive digital video walls that projected live updates under the Don Dapp banner. The jury retires. Miami 2012 cold case awaits final verdict. The investigative journalists stood prominently at the center of the media gates, their faces a portrait of profound physical exhaustion but absolute, unshakable peace, his ears tuned to the distant, rhythmic hum of a city that was finally about to witness the absolute execution of justice for a brilliant young woman whose voice had finally found its way home. The oppressive atmosphere of late June 2026 seemed to vanish entirely inside the packed, stone-cold gallery of courtroom 302, replaced by an absolute, electric stillness that signaled the final, historic convergence of a 14-year judicial hunt. The clock on the wall ticked with a heavy, mechanical cadence, each second driving a deeper wedge into the collapsing legacy of the Sterling shipping dynasty. For 3 agonizing weeks, the multi-agency task force operating under the banner of Operation Millennium Reckoning had delivered a Don Dapp, nonstop barrage of genomic certainty, cyber-forensic server restorations, and indisputable trace informatics. Now, the heavy oak doors leading to the jury deliberation chambers slowly clicked open, and the 12 citizens who held the final, unassailable truth of Miami's most notorious cold case walked back into the room with pale, solemn faces and unblinking eyes. Julian Sterling sat rigidly at the defense table, his multi-million-dollar legal architects flanking him like a hollow Praetorian guard whose shields had been utterly ground to dust by the power of molecular math. The 46-year-old former shipping titan looked remarkably fragile under the harsh, clinical glare of the courtroom floodlights, his tailored linen suit hanging loosely from his slumped shoulders, his hands trembling slightly as he stared blankly at the empty space before him. The elite psychological camouflage he had meticulously maintained for more than a decade, the public philanthropy, the millions of dollars donated to missing persons foundations, the staged tears at annual memorial galas for his sister Bianca, had been completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, calculated reality of a corporate predator exposed to the blinding light of public execution. The judge commanded absolute silence from the gallery, her gavel resting untouched on the bench as the court clerk stepped forward to receive the official verdict forms from the jury foreperson. The rustle of the heavy, state-stamped paper echoed through the breathless room like a sudden fracture in stone. The clerk, a veteran of the system whose voice carried the flat, clinical resonance of an unyielding administrative machine, adjusted her glasses and turned directly toward the digital recording arrays to enter the historic decree into the permanent archives of the state of Florida. On the master count of first-degree murder and kidnapping, encompassing the intentional, premeditated abduction and execution of Bianca Sterling on the night of August 14, 2012, inside the Coral Gables estate, how does this jury find? The clerk intoned, the words hanging in the frozen air like an unexploded charge. The foreperson, a high school statistics teacher who had listened to every hour of the genomic mapping data with focused intensity, looked directly across the floor, his eyes locking onto the defendant with absolute, chilling finality. We, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Montgomery Sterling, guilty of first-degree murder. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the gallery, instantly cut short by the immediate, imposing presence of state court officers who surrounded the defense table. Julian Sterling did not scream, he did not weep, and he did not launch into a frantic denial. He simply closed his eyes, a low, defeated sigh escaping his lips as 14 years of stolen luxury, corporate dominance, and calculated deception collapsed into absolute nothingness. The mathematical reality of the MVAC molecular sequencing, the 1 in 7.8 billion certainty that his own epithelial cells were ground deep into the internal matrix of the hidden structural vault, had systematically closed every constitutional loophole his wealth could buy, trapping him permanently within the vice of his own biological code. As the state guards stepped forward to clamp heavy steel handcuffs around Julian Sterling's wrists, stripping away the final remnants of his aristocratic authority, the prosecution team turned to each other with a look of quiet, exhausted triumph. The legal ledger for the Coral Gables execution was completely clear. The secret attic surveillance bunker had been vindicated, and the private waterfront quarters that had stood as a silent monument to forensic failure for more than a decade were finally washed clean of a stepbrother's malice. The long shadow of 2012 was officially, permanently dispelled from the streets of Miami, leaving behind an enduring, chilling lesson for the modern world. You can build an empire on a secret. You can hide behind uniforms, titles, and time, but human identity is permanent. The code of life does not decay, and the truth will eventually shatter the foundation to demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The transition from a frozen, decade-old missing persons file into a high-intensity, multi-agency criminal prosecution marked the formal initiation of a modern forensic siege within the walls of the Miami-Dade Police Headquarters. It was now early 2026, and the humid subtropical breeze rattling the exterior window panes did nothing to cool the intense, clinical heat generating inside the secure digital forensics laboratory. For 14 long years, the physical remnants of the Bianca Sterling disappearance had been trapped inside a standard, cardboard evidence container, indexed under a permanent cold case classification, and buried beneath millions of pages of older municipal files in the climate-controlled county archives. To the casual observer, the faded plastic bags containing a digital camera memory card and a preserved silk ribbon were nothing more than tragic, static relics of a bygone era, symbols of a night when the city's elite security systems had utterly failed. But as the multi-agency task force prepared to mount its primary investigative offensive, the physical geometry of a multi-million-dollar familial deception began to systematically unravel under the glare of mobile floodlights. The technical mechanics required to execute a comprehensive, microcellular extraction from the newly discovered attic vault without destroying the fragile, environmental exposed biological material were incredibly complex, demanding a level of microscopic precision that was entirely science fiction when the first sirens wailed in August 2012. Traditional forensic swabbing methods utilized during the early 21st century were only capable of collecting high-volume surface biological indicators, completely missing the microscopic skin cells that became deeply embedded within structural surfaces during a violent physical struggle or an extended period of high-stress surveillance. The state-of-the-art MVAC wet vacuum extraction system, newly deployed by federal microtrace specialists, utilized a specialized, pressurized sterile solution to gently dislodge the trapped cellular material from the porous wood beams and insulation linings of the hidden attic observation nest before immediately vacuuming the solution into a sterile collection chamber. Every square centimeter of the recovered surveillance gear, wiring harnesses, and synthetic containment tarps was systematically mapped under intense ultraviolet laser arrays, isolating the precise touchpoints where the predator's hands had manipulated the equipment to monitor the young oceanographer's final hours of life. Outside the secure perimeter of the police headquarters, behind double-layered rings of heavy yellow crime scene tape that blocked off the media access corridors along LaSalle Street, a massive sea of news trucks, legal analysts, and stunned Coral Gables residents braved the intense afternoon downpour. The sudden, explosive revelation that Julian Sterling, the billionaire maritime titan, the celebrated philanthropist and the self-proclaimed public crusader for missing persons, had been arrested for the brutal execution of his own sister, completely paralyzed the public consciousness. The narrative dominating every local and national television broadcast had violently shifted under the Don Dapp, rapid-fire banner. The waterfront predator. Miami 2012 cold case exploded. The case was no longer an ancient, tragic urban legend that belonged to the historical archives of a past decade. It had transformed into an active, bleeding systemic crisis that forced South Florida's elite high society to re-examine its most prominent philanthropic leaders through a lens of pure, unadulterated horror. Inside the secure digital forensics laboratory, the low, rhythmic whirring of the high-density genetic sequencers finally ceased, replaced by the sudden, sharp chime of a computer terminal indicating a complete, high-purity data match. The lead forensic genomics expert, working in tandem with the state's attorney's homicide unit, stared at the high-definition monitor as the digital graphs locked into an indisputable, mirroring alignment. The biological signature pulled from the deep weave of the materials found in the hidden attic did not merely suggest a familiar link to the Sterling family tree. It matched Julian Sterling's modern, legally obtained reference profile with an absolute mathematical certainty of 1 in 7.8 billion. The data proved with absolute scientific clarity that while the tropical storm of August 2012 had successfully deleted his physical footprints from the maritime docks of the mansion, it could not protect his microscopic biological signature from the unyielding, generational advance of modern molecular informatics. As the scientific link was solidified in the laboratory, a secondary, equally intense investigative offensive was unfolding inside the secure, heavily guarded financial crimes suite at the federal courthouse, where elite white-collar investigators were systematically dissecting the private financial ledger of the Sterling shipping empire from the early 2010s. The newly discovered attic surveillance logs had provided the initial, devastating roadmap, but it was the digital reconstruction of offshore banking records, hidden wire transfers, and fraudulent corporate loan applications that provided the ultimate, undeniable motive for the execution. Financial analysts uncovered a massive, clandestine network of illegal investment debts, shell company maneuvers, and failed international maritime speculations that had placed Julian Sterling on the absolute brink of total financial annihilation just days before Bianca vanished from her private waterfront bedroom. The financial data revealed a chillingly calculated, cold-blooded timeline of desperation that completely destroyed the ironclad alibi